All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending today. My name is Luke Baumgartner. I'm a research fellow here at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. Today I'm joined by Mr. Barry Black and Mr. William Teeter. They are two former FBI agents who have extensive experience working on the Oklahoma City bombing case, and that's what we're here today to discuss. Since it's been almost 30 years to the day of the Oklahoma City bombing, I thought it would be apt for us to reflect on the events of that day and how the domestic terrorism landscape has changed since then. So before we get into our event and before I start asking our questions for the formal part of this event, I would like to extend the opportunity to our two panelists to introduce themselves and to sort of give a brief overview of their expertise and their familiarity with the case.
Well, good afternoon, Lucas. Pleasure to be with you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. As you said, my name's Barry Black. I retired after 31 years in the FBI. I'm an accountant that ended up being a sniper and a bomb technician. Worked internationally with our military partners and other counterterrorism units in the global war on terror. And now I'm at the University of Central Oklahoma Forensic Science Institute.
Yes, Luke. My name's William Teeter. I'm a retired agent, 25 years. I was a municipal police officer for 11 years before that. And since I retired, I have a one man, meaning me, investigative business that I've had for several years. And I was involved with the bombing investigation from the early part of the bomb, following the bombing until it had went to trial and was finished in 1997. Following the bombing trials and everything, I was promoted to a supervisor in Oklahoma City and had investigative oversight and supervision of domestic terrorism, international terrorism, as well as foreign counterintelligence. Did that for about 5 years and then transferred to another assignment within the Oklahoma City field office.
So, folks in the audience, as you can see, we have a very distinguished and accomplished group of panelists joining me today. So, without further ado, we will get into the questions for the formal portion of our event. So, first, I kind of want to start with a bit of background about Timothy McVeigh himself, the perpetrator of the bombing. Either of you feel free to answer these questions or chime in when you feel the need to. So broadly speaking, who was Timothy McVeigh, the mastermind behind the attack? Where was he from? How did he grow up? What sort of background factors in his life made him an important part of this investigation, an important part of the plot?
Well, he grew up like many with sort of a rough childhood. He thought a lot of his grandfather, who sort of indoctrinated him into sort of a survivalist mentality, familiar with weapons as most people might be. Joined the military, was actually decorated, um, then attempted to join the special forces, didn't make that cut, separated from the military, and then was just sort of itinerant, living with his former Army buddies, fell into the gun show circuit, and became kind of radicalized with a deep-seated hatred for the American U.S. government.
Yeah, he grew up in a suburb of Buffalo, New York, Lockport, New York, as I recall. Went to high school, graduated. He had his father was a white collar worker in a radiator uh, factory. His mother had some jobs. The mother and father had some marital difficulties, and they uh, separated, and then eventually, I guess, were divorced, and she had moved away. Had an older sister. Um, I believe her name was Patricia, and another sister named Jennifer. Uh, the breakup of his parents really affected him quite a bit. Um, like Barry was saying, his grandfather had given him a rifle, and he got interested in hunting, and he ended up being a pretty good shot with the rifle. And before he went into the military, he uh, worked as a security guard, had some other jobs as well. Might have worked in a fast food restaurant, and then joined the United States Army in May of 1998, and was went through basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. After basic, he went to Fort Riley, Kansas, into the infantry, and those in the basic training within Fort Benning were Michael Fortier and Terry Nichols, and they also were assigned to Fort Riley.
Yeah, so drawing on that thread of his military service, according to his own letters, his testimony, and his own writings, his experiences in the military, in particular the Gulf War, in January 1991, drastically sort of shifted his worldview and his ideology. So how did those experiences negatively impact him and drive him further into his anti-government extremism?
Well, as I recall, he had the sense that the folks we were fighting were just like us, and he fell into this impression that America was oppressive. Even though he was decorated and wanted to continue his military career, it didn't work out like he wanted. And as I said, at that point, he became kind of disenchanted and started promoting this book called The Turner Diaries, which he had an affinity for. It was a fictional work that starts out with a large vehicle board and IED destroying FBI headquarters with the point of starting a revolution, and that was sort of his model or game plan for what he had planned in the future.
Yeah,
Yes,
Bill,
yes, sir.
you briefly mentioned Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier, two individuals that he met while he was in the military, and they ended up becoming his accomplices. So, what sort of role did they play in McVeigh's plot, and more broadly his sort of arc into his radical anti-government beliefs?
During his time in basic training and then at Fort Riley, uh, McVeigh, pretty much, he wasn't one to go out and party with the other soldiers in his unit. He stayed back and read quite a bit. He maybe somewhat of a loner, not a socializer that much. Nichols was somewhat older than Fortier and McVeigh. In his basic training, they called Nichols the old man. He was maybe 8 to 10 years older, as I recall, and he'd had difficulties in Michigan, in business of farming and that, and he saw the military maybe as a place for him to make another start. However, he left on a hardship within about a year, or maybe right at the year. Fortier left a little bit later than Nichols, but not much more than a year in as well. So McVeigh pushed the book, The Turner Diaries, quite a bit on people that he felt comfortable with, and was somewhat obsessed with that book and the things that had happened around the country. He got involved in gun rights, etc. The Brady assassination attempt in 1981. There were various laws that were being contemplated and probably, as I recall, put into effect with gun rights. I also recall he may have been upset with the National Rifle Association, didn't think that they were strong enough for his beliefs. Um, Nichols seemed to be one that would follow and listen quite a bit to McVeigh and his ideas about fairness in the government, et cetera. And with his experiences um, failing uh, his endeavors in trying to have a business or in the farming industry, and that didn't work out. So he was susceptible to listening to what others had to say, including McVeigh.
Yeah, excellent. So moving on, we've both of you have briefly mentioned, the Turner Diaries, in passing, and Barry, I think you're probably the expert on this one. So you said that that's where McVeigh drew inspiration for the actual construction of the bomb. Can you go in a little more depth about what sort of information he gleaned from that book in, designing and actually building it?
Sure. Yeah, there were actually a number of references in that text about the IED itself, but the device McVeigh ended up building was a homemade explosive. The acronym is ANFO. It's ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, which was the bomb featured in that book. And he had some other materials that he had obtained concerning bomb building, but the device itself was based with fertilizer. Of course, Kansas, where Terry Nichols was living, is an agrarian state, uh, but the purchase of tons of fertilizer was unusual, and it ended up being about 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, which they had purchased. And then you need fuel for the other half of that equation. So they posed as a motorcycle racer and bought several barrels of nitromethane, which is race car fuel. Um, it's a very forgiving recipe. I don't recommend you make ANFO, but it's a very forgiving recipe. So in this case, nitromethane and the ammonium nitrate. But ANFO doesn't want to explode very readily. It's very insensitive. So you need something called a booster. Um, International terrorists make highly sensitive primary explosives. It's dangerous. So a better way, if you're a terrorist, as opposed to making your own booster, is to steal the explosives. So during this investigation, once we had centered on that area of Kansas, I went through the stolen explosive reports. If you lose or have your explosives stolen, you have to report that. So we went through the stolen explosive reports and found roughly 500 pounds of high explosives had been stolen from a quarry nearby, along with detonators. Um, and then the forensic evidence that came from that theft was tied back to a search warrant at Nichols' home, not far after the bombing itself.
Yeah. So you know, what about the device that McVeigh constructed made it so powerful? What made it, basically level the Murrah building?
So ANFO is designed as a heaving type of charge. Its velocity is such that it's very good at pushing things out of the way. For instance, if you wanted to create a crater in a runway or something, ANFO is good for that because it has that pushing and heaving effect. Something like C4 has a higher, what we call brisance, more of a shattering effect. So that large volume, a nearly 5,000 pound device, had a tremendous effect on the immediate environment. It destroyed the Murrah building and damaged about 300 buildings in the surrounding area. That detonation, it detonates spherically. So not only does that shock go into the atmosphere above the ground, it's transmitted through the earth as well. It's known as earth shock or ground shock. And that ground shock registered 3.2 on the Richter scale, like an earthquake. It was a tremendous blast.
Yeah. So I think in total it was closer to, with the truck and with the materials, it was closer to, about a 8,000 pound sort of explosive, if my memory serves me correct.
Well, if you we found receipts for the purchase of 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate. We know they bought 3 barrels of nitromethane. We know how much of the booster was stolen. When you combine all of that, the explosive weight itself approximates 5,000 pounds of the IED.
Hmm.
Of course, if you incorporate the vehicle weight and that, it would go up. Uh, we generally look at the components of the device when we look at the size of the bomb itself. We're confident in the ammonium nitrate purchase because there were receipts and fingerprints, and we traced the money. The nitromethane's the same, and then the theft itself. So it's difficult when you start dealing with devices of that magnitude. Um, we had now it's all computerized. Back in the day, we had a wheel, a physical wheel to estimate damage, and you could come up with the general size of the device. And it was estimated early on to be 4 to 6,000 pounds. And as we found the evidence of the purchase and acquisition of the components, it fell right within that range.
Yeah. Um, so I think that's a good point to kind of pivot into the actual events of that day. So while both of you were going through, the aftermath of that day, um, so what did McVeigh actually do that morning on April 19th, 1995? So what were his how did you trace his steps from that day?
Well, uh, Bill, I'm sure, has a perspective as well. McVeigh and Nichols had dropped off their getaway vehicle on Easter Sunday, the Sunday before the bombing. And that morning, they had mixed the device at a place called Geary Lake there in Kansas. And the morning of the bombing, we believe he lit 2 burning time fuses. We have a surveillance image from an apartment complex where we believe he lit those fuses and then drove the device directly in front of the Murrah building, almost dead center, left the vehicle. He had told Fortier in a reconnaissance trip back in December what his getaway route would be. He was going to go down an alley kind of diagonally from the Murrah building, using what was then the YMCA as sort of a blast shield in case the bomb went off a little early, and made it his way to that old yellow Mercury that you may be familiar with, that he had positioned the previous Sunday, and headed north on I-35 back to Dallas, or I'm sorry, back to Kansas. Um, a highway patrol trooper, Charlie Hanger, was southbound coming into the city to assist, but was told to turn back around to his patrol area. And as he turned back north, McVeigh passed him in that Mercury. Charlie noticed he didn't have a tag, so he pulled him over for failing to display a license plate. As McVeigh got out of the car, Trooper Hanger saw that he had what looked like a pistol under his jacket. So he arrested him for what was then illegally possessing a weapon, concealed weapon, and failure to display a plate. And he was sitting in county jail. Uh, and then through some other investigative techniques, we did what's called an offline NCIC search for McVeigh by name on the night of the 20th and found that he was still in jail. And that's how we ended up putting him in federal custody.
After the bomb exploded from the Ryder truck, the differential, the rear axle differential, was launched, and it was described as like a helicopter through the air, and it landed to the west of the bombing site, crashed upon a little car, um, and that was pretty much mostly the full differential. And as the investigation proceeded, obviously this big piece of metal's in the middle of the street on a car. An officer arrived and was familiar with confidential VIN numbers and located the partial number that was relayed back to the command post, and then that was queried through, I believe it's the National Insurance Crime Bureau, who has extensive records, and it identified what type of vehicle that had been on, and the owner of the vehicle, and which led then to the investigation of where that vehicle had come from, being Junction City, Kansas. It had been rented there, and then the leads sent there and followed through, identified who had rented the truck, and led to later on the link of McVeigh and the renter of the truck, alias. And as Barry was saying, the McVeigh was sitting in a county jail in northern Oklahoma. A offline search was conducted, and a man by the name of McVeigh quite possibly could be in that area. They called the sheriff. Sheriff said he was in custody, at which time agents responded to the scene to meet with him, and later took custody of McVeigh, and the investigation continued on.
Yeah, that differential or rear end differential housing was blown a city block away. And early that morning, it was actually a reserve deputy sheriff called myself and the other FBI bomb technician, Jim Norman, over, and he wiped some grease away with his finger, revealing that CVIN. Jim wrote it down. I wrote it down. We called it out to make sure there were no Scrivener's errors, and Jim gave his note. Again, there weren't cell phones back then, so he handed the note to a runner who took it to the command post, and then using the Insurance Bureau information, we determined it came back to a Ford Motor Company product. Ford said it belonged to Ryder Rental. Ryder Rental said it belonged to Elliott's Body Shop in Junction City, Kansas, and we flooded that area in Junction City with law enforcement, and that's what resulted in the sketches that we know as John Doe 1 and John Doe 2.
Yeah. So I think that's a good jumping off point to sort of talk about both of your experiences on the scene that day. So where were each of you on the actual day of the bombing?
Bill?
I worked on another squad that was outside of the Oklahoma City field office. I was about 5 miles away when the blast went off. As many others in Oklahoma City felt the blast. Of course, there was immediate news coverage, helicopters flying over. At first, it was thought there'd been some work downtown, as I recall, on some natural gas lines, and they thought that might have been the cause of the explosion. However, the look at the federal building and agents arriving on scene, the bomb technicians immediately recognized that it was a bomb that had been set off. I was assigned to a surveillance squad, so I did not respond to the scene. We were positioned to respond to any surveillances that might come about as a result of the explosion, and spent most of the day waiting and waiting. And then as resources started arriving in Oklahoma City, minute by minute, every half hour, resources were coming in from all over the United States, bomb techs, evidence people, other agents driving in from Kansas City, Dallas, and other field offices in the surrounding area. Worked, through the night, getting people from the airport. I transported several bomb techs down to the site, and I remember them explaining what their theory of what it was. So anyway, we worked through the night, and then the next day started covering the many leads that were set forth, and I believe a day or so afterwards, I was assigned to the command post. Information had been developed that McVeigh had been in the military, And I, along with some other agents, were tasked with uh, finding out everything we could about his military experience. And then uh, we worked closely with the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. They had assets on scene and started tracing back to McVeigh's first day in the military and eventually locating and interviewing over 600 what we called military associates. They weren't necessary associates of McVeigh, but they'd been in training companies and at various places that McVeigh had been. So, as I say, about 600 some were located and interviewed. Those interviews, after many years from 1988 to 95, there were people were scattered around the United States. Former military soldiers had moved elsewhere, taken up careers. Some were overseas. There were even a few that were truck drivers. One guy was located sleeping in a truck in some city, whatever. So they were scattered all over the United States. So hundreds of leads were set out and pretty much located everyone to gather information about McVeigh and who his close circle of associates were.
Yeah, for me that morning, I was still on the SWAT team at the time and had an arrest warrant for a fugitive. I was about 7 linear miles from the seat of the blast when it detonated. Of course, you could hear it, you could feel it, and Oklahoma's flat and windy, so I could look over to my west and see the big cloud of smoke already drifting across downtown. Um, the FBI had just started what we call the evidence response team. Most people know it as CSI now, but ours is called ERT. So I'd helped start the ERT here in Oklahoma City, and I'd been a bomb technician for exactly 53 weeks. This was my first bombing case after being certified by the Bureau. But went to the scene. I arrived about 9:30 and did what we call an initial assessment because, as Bill had mentioned, there had been some work downtown. There was really no initial thought of terrorism. In 1995, that was just not on anybody's mind. There had been the previous attack in 93 at the First World Trade Center, but plane crash, gas main explosion, some kind of accident. But the initial assessment, that post-blast assessment, was indicative of a large vehicle-borne IED. There was a 32-foot crater in the street. The damage was unbelievable. It was cars were burning across the street. There were people trapped inside, victims that did not survive. Um, all these scenes are just absolute chaos, mayhem. Firefighters are putting out the fires. Rescue workers are trying to extricate people that are trapped. So a lot of things have to happen at the same time. So that day I spent on scene. There was a what they call a second bomb scare, which caused a pause in the evacuation procedures. But there are just a lot of things that have to happen at once. So as the command post was established off-site, information we were able to glean from the scene itself was passed, like the CBIN, for instance, to the command post. So the broader external investigation, as Bill was describing, could take advantage of information we were getting on the scene, and then conversely, as information from that broader external investigation could be passed to the folks on scene to try to make sense of what we were seeing there.
Yeah, so I think that's another good pivot into the larger sort of game plan of the investigation. I know Bill, you briefly touched on, the immediate sort of investigative aspects, finding all these people that he served with while he was in the military, tracking them down and interviewing. But what else did the, subsequent investigation over the next, year, 2 years, reveal about McVeigh's connections to other folks within, the anti-government sort of movement more broadly?
Well, as we talked about, he'd been involved in reading the Turner Diaries. Once he exited or was discharged from the military and had completed his time, he went back to work in the Buffalo area. Went back to work for a security guard company or security company, and those that he came into contact with, he was talking to them about what he had read and his feelings and that. And then he was reaching out to others that he had met. He kept up with, eventually remade contact with Nichols and Fortier. As Barry said earlier, he was on got involved in the gun show circuit, a lot of gun shows in the United States. He went around to various gun shows, met various people, and just continued on down that track. April 19th of '93 was the Waco. I don't want to call it an incident, but the fire of the Ranch Davidians happened. He had been down there prior to the April 19th. He had, I believe, was passing out some literature. He was anti-government, and he was involved in expressing his disdain with that. And as I said, continuing going around to the gun shows and everything. He met various people and met a large gun dealer from Arkansas who later was robbed, and the proceeds of that robbery, were used to support himself and get other supplies that were needed. Some of the people that he came into contact with, coworkers, they realized that he was quite extreme. And one fellow that he worked with was very pleased the day that they left, because he thought it was totally extreme of what was going on in McVeigh's actions and mine, and what he was telling others.
So, moving on towards, the trial of McVeigh, um, the venue was moved initially from Oklahoma City up to Denver. Um, why was the venue moved to Colorado?
So it was determined that Nichols and McVeigh would be tried separately.
Hmm.
McVeigh was tried first, and his defense attorney made the motion or felt that he couldn't receive a fair trial here in Oklahoma because of the magnitude of this case, the media coverage, and really most everybody here had been touched in some way. So the judge relocated the trial to Denver, and we, with the U.S. Attorney's Office, culled through the thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence down to just what we would need at trial, and it was enough to fill three semi trucks. Of course, you have to worry that something may happen to the evidence in transit. So I was still on the SWAT team at the time, so we had SWAT operators in the cab of each truck, lead and chase car for each of the three trucks, lead and chase car for the whole convoy, and then air cover above to see if there was any problem. We coordinated that transfer with the various states' highway patrol so that we wouldn't have to stop for toll booths or anything like that. And we arrived in Denver. I remember it was a clear night, and transferred the evidence to a secure facility, turned it over to the Denver office, and then a smaller team from what we called the Oak Palm Task Force here in Oklahoma literally moved to Denver and stayed there for the duration of the trial. I went up three times during that process. The last time was to testify to a single piece of evidence that was being contested. But before I took the stand, the defense stipulated, and that was my part for that trial.
We don't want to overlook also, talked about locating and interviewing these military so-called associates and everything. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of leads that were generated by the public. There were investigative teams set up, particular for investigative team for McVeigh, investigative team for Nichols, Fortier, and other investigative teams. There was a large command post set up in what was once a newspaper building that was leased by the government to house the bombing task force, and that was in operation for just about a year. In the first days after the bombing, the first command post was in an old telephone building, and there was telephone lines set up. And a lighter point is you're in the phone company's building, but when it rained, the roof leaked, and many times the telephones failed to operate for us. So we had to face that for several days and everything. And then finally we moved to this other building, the Oklahoma Publishing Building, Oklahoma Paper Publishing Building. And the task force was set up. There was over 100 agents assigned and over 100 clerical employees, and leads went out all over the country. Various leads were developed. We could go on for quite some time here. There was a calling card. There were people who looked at the drawings that had been artist composition of McVeigh and another fellow. So people called in identifying who they thought that person was, and that resulted in hundreds, if not thousands, of leads to locate these people. There was also the Ryder truck was one of many that were rented, as you can imagine, in the United States. So the Ryder truck rental agreements were obtained, and people were located that rented the trucks. And just, you can imagine, there was all types of things going on. McVeigh liked to stay in cheap motels. So just as an example of some of the work that was generated, every motel between Junction City and Oklahoma City, and then Oklahoma City to Kingman, Arizona, where Fortier was, all the lower priced motels, guest folios were gathered, and there was something like 20 million, I recall, being gathered. And they set up a computer database, and they entered about 2 million of those in there. Those leads led to other aliases used by McVeigh and Nichols, and variations of their name, which led to other leads to see who in the United States had that name and driver's licenses, and locating and interviewing those people. And then there was a telephone debit card that was discovered, and agents were assigned to research and follow the leads from that. I believe there were about 600 calls generated by that card. McVeigh and Nichols did think these numbers would be traceable. However, with anything, there's always a record somewhere, and the investigative teams worked that and developed extensive leads to help in the investigation of the bombing.
Yeah, the logistics in a case like this are unbelievable. The two sketches resulted in John Doe 1, John Doe 2. Bill had mentioned before that McVeigh had worked for a security firm up in New York. One of the calls we got based on those sketches, there were, as I recall, 15,000 leads generated from the sketches. One of them said, "Hey, I recognize John Doe number 1. He was a security guard with me at Burns Security." McVeigh had a Burns Security badge with him when he was arrested by Trooper Hanger. Um, yeah, there was, as I recall, 1,008,000 man hours were expended during the course of the investigation, and the volume of data that was reviewed and culled through was remarkable. When uh, it was determined that a man known as Robert Kling had rented that Ryder truck, uh, the broader investigation that Bill described with the hotels and motels turned up the Dreamland Motel, and a lady there named Leah McGowan said, "Well, yeah, I recognize number one, but I think his name's Tim McVeigh." So we had McVeigh and Kling. She said he was driving an old yellow car. Then he saw him. Then she saw him with a Ryder truck. So just to make sure no one named Tim McVeigh had rented a Ryder truck, we went through 13.1 million Ryder records just to show that no one named Tim McVeigh had not rented the truck. So logistically, it's quite an undertaking given the technology available in 1995. It'd be a little easier today.
Yeah, it sounds, the mental picture that I'm getting after hearing the details about the volume of evidence that was presented and gathered is just like this ever expanding spider web of connections from one piece of evidence or data to another that's going on infinitely is what it comes across to me. Um, and with that, I kind of want to conclude, the formal portion by going over what eventually happened at the trial. For the sake of brevity, I will just say that, McVeigh was obviously found guilty. It took, I think, less than 24 hours of jury deliberation for them to return a guilty verdict. And he was ultimately sentenced to death. And he was executed in 2001, I believe.
Yes.
Um, and so what happened to his accomplices, mainly Nichols and Fortier? What sort of sentences did they receive?
So Terry Nichols was sentenced to life at the Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, where the shoe bomber Richard Reed is the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski passed away there. He will spend the rest of his life there. The state of Oklahoma also tried him for the state crime of murder. There were only 8 deaths in the federal indictment. Those were the 8 federal agents that were killed at the bombing. But the state wanted to account for those Oklahomans that died. So he was also convicted on a state level for 169 counts of murder. There was a fetus involved. So should he ever get out of federal custody, he'll face state prison here in Oklahoma. Fortier and his wife, Lori, entered into a plea agreement, agreed to testify on behalf of the government. And Fortier was sentenced to, I believe, 12 years. He served about 10 of that. And both of them now are effectively in the witness protection program.
Yeah. So my last question, or two questions basically. Um, in the 30 years since the bombing, how would each of you sort of describe its legacy, and what sort of lessons have we learned about domestic terrorism since then?
Bill?
Well, following the bombing, there were quite a few stories told about the good people of Oklahoma. As Barry said, there were 300 buildings damaged, some terribly, some maybe broken windows, cracked facades, etc. However, there was not one bit of looting that occurred in Oklahoma City. I also recall the police saying that very little crime, reported crime, occurred in the days following Oklahoma City bombing, and many of the workers who came, rescue workers, law enforcement people that came to help, uh, when they would finish their shift and perhaps go to a restaurant, their meal was either comped by the restaurant, or citizens would pay for their meal. And I'd heard recently in some of the remembrances, I believe somebody told former Governor Keating. He held up a $1 bill in his hand and told the governor that he arrived in Oklahoma City with this $1 bill and he hadn't spent a dime due to the generous people of Oklahoma City. And the term Oklahoma Standard uh, was coined, I believe the first time I heard it was coined after that. And it's followed through with other tragedies in Oklahoma, including tornado disasters and that type of thing. It's just that's one of the legacies I think everyone who lives in Oklahoma City, in Oklahoma, and in the United States can be very, very proud of the very uh, excellent legacy on looking at it in that sense. Another thing, legacies were following the bombing. Terrorism task force were set up around the United States. Uh, Most of them, or all of them, started by the FBI. However, other federal agencies, state agencies, municipalities participate, uh, so that when something happens and people arrive on scene, something like this bombing or even smaller incidents, you know who the other people are, you know what their responsibilities are in general, what yours are, and try to avoid as much chaos. One of the things I remember that we studied quite a bit was incident command response of the how the police department rescuers work, and we also learned. I wasn't really familiar with what FEMA was, and in those days, in the hours following the bombing, FEMA was here and equipment was coming in. You know, they had cranes and trucks, you know, to assist in recovery and rescue efforts. So that continued into our training and exercises into the future following the bombing. So that's another legacy that was developed and continue, as far as I know, continues to this day, being prepared. And the main thing is sharing information. I'm sure that there's a lot of information shared in the way that was done in the early days of the bombing, but now it's more structured and everything.
Yeah, we hired local, heavy equipment operators or whatnot because of the volume of debris on scene. And fast forward to 9/11, I was deployed to Ground Zero up in New York, and my cell phone rang. This man said, "You might not remember me, but I was a heavy equipment operator in Oklahoma City. If you need me, my equipment, my people in New York, just let me know." So that's the kind of response the people of Oklahoma were willing to provide. There was a credit union in the building, and I spoke with some of the credit union folks. They said more money was turned into the credit union than they had to start with. So the looting and crime was not a problem. Everybody came together in a way that, as Bill says, now known as the Oklahoma Standard.
Yeah, that's a really good lesson to glean from that is the community response that comes together after an event like that. So with that, we will conclude the formal portion of our event and we'll move on to the audience Q&A. So drawing on both of your folks' experience, not just with Oklahoma City, but with terrorism and counterterrorism investigations more broadly. Um, so some of the questions that we've gotten, um, one of them is, how has the OKC bombing changed the way that we conceptualize radicalization? Are there warning signs that we recognize today that we missed then? So again, sort of the lessons learned about, identifying threats or potential threats.
Well, after 9/11, the phrase "see something, say something" became pretty popular. I think people were generally reluctant to call about what may be disturbing activity. But when you see something like the dramatic uptick in active shooters, school shootings, there are usually some warning signs that someone close
believe we've lost Barry. Uh-oh. Well, technical difficulties.
As Barry was saying, people see things that are happening, see something, report something. I want to add that recently in Oklahoma, there is and I'm sure this is all around the United States, but in Oklahoma, in the recent past, a program was set up, an app that you can get on your cell phone called Protect Oklahoma. And you can report things that should be reported to authorities. And it's a better way to a lot of people being able to, text it out and send it electronically than perhaps trying to go to the police station or the sheriff's office or the Bureau of Investigation, what have you. So that's something that is quite helpful. I'm not sure how long it's been underway. Probably maybe up to a year or maybe less than a year. I'm not sure on that. There's also systems set up, and I'm sure this is all over the United States as well, where you can send text messages to 911 now if you don't want to talk and you're concerned about something, and those can be handled. Or you could be in a situation where you're watching something and you can't make a call, and you could get on the 911 text, and they can figure out where you are and converse with you to get a quick response.
Yeah. Um, so what commonalities exist between McVeigh's path and the trajectories of more recent domestic violent extremists, if you've noticed any?
Well, it seems like sometimes these guys are loner. They're not have a lot of social skills, perhaps keep to themselves. Not somebody that goes out and has a conversation with someone else. Not meaning all of them do, but seems like a lot of them lack, maybe interpersonal relationships and communication skills and that. Perhaps going on their own, maybe like the lone wolf. And again, that is not clear across the board, but just unusual things like that. And if you see something that's like that, that just seems odd to you, there's ways to report this information and to start making a record of it, so it comes across the so-called radar screen of somebody that, like there's something wrong. Somebody else may see something of the same person a day or two later, or a week later, or a month later, but those things are very important to report. And many times you hear, well, we never thought it could happen here. And that's very easy to fall into. I've seen things myself and, like, wow, I don't know about that. And luckily nothing ever happened, but just be in a position where you can take note of it. If it's safe, make maybe a video recording of it. That might be a little bit dangerous depending on the circumstances, or make a recording of the license plate number, or those type of things. But don't do anything to put yourself in danger. Just be aware.
Yeah. So to what extent do you think today's violent extremists have learned from McVeigh? Um, how much have they, gleaned inspiration from him and his actions?
Well, I've been away from that for quite a few years, but I think it's probably common knowledge that one individual can do a lot of damage. Whether it be with a bomb, carrying a knife, carrying a firearm, driving a car into a crowd. It doesn't have to be a group of people. It can be an individual, and a lot of publicity comes out. Some of the individuals, I'm very sure, are keen on the publicity and probably would like to hear their name mentioned as to something that they had done, as we've seen in some recent events. I don't care to even give them any more publicity than what they have, but I think everyone would have a memory of something recent that has happened, that there's lone individuals.
Yeah, I think, it's come up a lot, not necessarily a lot, but not an infrequent number of times where we've seen this recent milieu of accelerationists and violent domestic violent extremists, you know, paying homage to McVeigh. In the most extreme militant crop of extremists that a lot of us look at today and the ones that we see that are posing the biggest threats, they revere McVeigh as a saint. That is very common in the saints culture that is associated with um, a lot of the recent groups that have come out since 2016, 2017-ish, that look up to him as an idol and as something or somebody to emulate. There was one individual from Florida who was arrested. His name is Brandon Russell. He was a member of Atomwaffen Division. He was most recently convicted in the District of Maryland for plotting to blow up the power grid in Baltimore. But in his first case, some of the evidence that was presented, at least in the court documents and everything that's publicly available, he had a framed picture of Timothy McVeigh in his bedroom while the authorities were executing a search warrant. So I think that shows, the extent of what sort of impact McVeigh has had on this domestic violent extremist crop, and especially the newer ones. It's not necessarily that they've evolved ideologically, or tactically. It's about this lineage of violence that myself and my colleagues have, constantly hit on when we do these sorts of events or we give public presentations, just for people to see the connections and see how that thread is woven throughout, not just time and space, and how it's still present to this day. One last question that we'll answer that before we sign off for the day. So this is more geared towards, the investigative aspect and your role in the case. How did you maintain resilience while working on a case of this sort of magnitude?
That's an interesting question. I always wondered that before. There were hundreds of people working close quarters with one another. And I truthfully don't remember, I don't have a memory of anyone getting sick or getting the flu or being gone for days, because this went over into the spring and then into the winter. That building was old. So the conditions, although they were very, very bearable, but there were still some, issues with different things. And just get that amount of people in a closed environment, it amazed me that we didn't have a lot of illness going through there, and many of us, many of the agents and the support people, were people who took care of themselves physically, worked out in that. Unfortunately, a lot of that had to go away. There were many days that were 16, 18-hour days. And for the longest time, there were no days off. And I remember fondly, we were at some point, I don't remember how far into the investigation, got a day off a week. And it was like, wow, look at this. And that was pretty amazing. And there were many others who didn't take a day off. So I don't know. I don't know what kept everything health-wise doing that. I think there was everybody had feelings about wanting to find out what happened and find out everything that we could, make sure that everyone who was responsible for the bombing was brought to justice. And I think that drove people to ignore being fatigued and might have even helped just not getting ill. I may be playing that a little bit too much, but I've been around other situations where things went through a crowd like that fairly quick. But that's my opinion of that.
Yeah, a shared common goal keeps everybody, working on the same sheet of music and working towards eventually finding out what happened, regardless of the circumstances.
I had
Uh,
one other thing, if I may, that I'd like
yeah,
to add. We had a few minutes here to talk about the investigation and everything and how it came about, and it's so huge that you couldn't cover it in days of discussing. Uh, Two agents wrote a book on it called Plain Truths. The authors are John Hersley and Larry Tungate. If your audience would like to look uh, further into the investigations, how things were developed, it's an excellent publication that lays out the investigation, different avenues of how evidence was gathered, the significance of it, and then the insignificance of other information that was turned over to the task force that had to be investigated that led nowhere. But I would highly recommend that publication to anyone who is interested. Again, it's called Plain Truth.
well, thank you for that, Bill. We'll be sure to make sure that our audience gets that information. So with that, we will conclude today's events. Unfortunately, due to technical difficulties, Mr. Black had to drop out. But we appreciate everybody showing up today. We thank the audience for their questions, and we especially thank our panelists, Mr. Black and Mr. Teeter, for joining us today and taking the time to discuss this important event and the legacy that's left on the landscape of domestic terrorism in the U.S. As always, you can find our recordings on YouTube after this event concludes, and be sure to join our email list. And with that, we'll be signing off, and thank you.